All right, so A2 MCQs, October, November 2019, variant 2, a paper requested for by Aiden, and let's just jump straight in. So some MNC, so some multinational oil companies extracting oil in the developing world are now required to repair the damage they do to the environment, which best describes the total costs incurred by the oil companies in such circumstances. So note that initially, this damage to the environment, this was all external costs, which the companies did not have to pay for, and it did not factor into their total cost calculation. Now they are required to, repair the damage they do to the environment. So they are required to pay for external costs. So their total cost would be their private costs, which they were paying for anyways. So the cost of production, the cost of hiring labor, all of that, plus the external cost, that is the damage done to the environment. This is a new thing that is now included in their total cost calculation. And thus the corresponding answer would be private costs plus external costs. Question 2. In an economy, no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. So basically your Pareto optimality condition. What does not necessarily follow from this? The conditions for allocative efficiency have been met. This is true because Pareto optimality also refers to allocative efficiency. So the idea that you cannot reallocate resources in a way to make someone else better off without having to make someone else worse off. So through this statement, you can also follow through for allocative efficiency. And we're looking for not, so we can cross this out. The conditions for productive efficiency have been met. This is also true. Let's just look at this in terms of a PPC. So let's suppose we're here. Now, by definition, we have to be on a point on the PPC. Because if you were on a point, let's say A below the PPC, we could just employ more resources and move from a point of underemployment to a point of full employment. And that way we could make someone better off without having to necessarily make other people worse off. We would just be employing more resources. Here, though, since we know that we can't make anyone else better off without having to make someone else worse off, this necessarily means we are already on some point on the PPC already. If you're on any point below, we could have simply moved towards PPC and had benefit without having to make anyone else worse off. Thus, from this statement, we can conclude that we are on the PPC. And if we are on the PPC, then the conditions for productive efficiency from an economy's perspective have been met, simply because if you're on the PPC, you're already producing the maximum amount you can with your given set of resources and technology. This is the odd one out because all of this is referring to output and like how much you're producing, where you are on the PPC, but this is not necessarily referring to the distribution of income being socially acceptable. Again, we don't study the social acceptability of the distribution of income. This does vary depending on different social structures, but generally, like, we don't look at the distribution of income at all. It's completely fine for you to be Pareto efficient, allocatively efficient, and productively efficient, but still have horrendous income inequality. And yeah, a point on the PPC is just something I just explained, so you can cross that out as well. Question 3. A government decided to approve a road building scheme because it was socially beneficial. So the government does look at external costs and external benefits. So if it's socially beneficial, it means that social benefit, which includes external benefit, has to be greater than social cost. So this is what we're looking for. In making its decision, it calculated private costs to be 800, private benefits to be 800, and external costs to be 150, which means social costs, which are just private costs plus external costs, are going to be 950. We don't know external benefit. What must have been true about external benefits of this scheme? Now, if you think about it, social benefit has to be at least 950. Like, it has to be probably greater than 950, so that social benefit is greater than social cost. So we know that social benefit has to be greater than social cost, which is 950. We also know that social benefit is simply private benefit plus external benefit, and this has to be greater than 950. We also know that private benefit is 800 plus external benefit is unknown, has to be greater than 950. So external benefit has to be greater than 950 minus 800 is 150. So external benefit has to be greater than 150. And in this case, the correct option would be external benefits exceeded external cost, because your external cost was also 150. So saying external benefit is greater than 150 is the same thing as saying external benefit exceed external cost. Perhaps a simpler way to look at this is, private costs and private benefits are the same. They're both 800. So if external costs are 150, then external benefits have to be more than 150 for the overall thing to be socially beneficial, for the overall social benefit to be greater than social cost. Let's go on to question number 4. What is it called when a consumer's marginal utility is greater than the price paid for the good? This has gone a little messy, but this is called consumer surplus. If you just draw a demand diagram, let's suppose this is the price, right? This is the price you pay for the good. We know that the area below the demand curve and above the price level is your consumer surplus. The reason for that is because every point on the demand curve indicates how much you are willing to pay for like that specific quantity. And it indicates this because it shows the amount of utility you would get for that specific quantity, or the amount of marginal utility for that specific unit, which is why you're willing to pay this much. So because this is greater than price, this is what shows your consumer surplus, that for a unit, the specific utility you get from a unit, i.e. the marginal utility you get from that unit, is greater than the cost of it, the price you pay for it. And it's that difference that essentially is what we define as consumer surplus, because the consumer is facing a surplus, like they're getting a more valuable thing for, and they're paying the price is less than the value they associate with the object. Question 5, a consumer has to spend $3, a consumer has $3 to spend each day on chocolate bars or toffee bars, all which cost $1. So everything is $1. The table below shows the units of additional satisfaction, so your marginal utility she gets from consuming each bar. And you can see the table here. What should she buy to maximize her total utility? So we have to go for the highest marginal utility for every single decision, such that our total utility is maximized. And we can buy 3 things because we have $3 and everything costs $1 each. Now, on the first step, we should clearly pick the chocolate bar, because that could give us a marginal utility of 16, which is greater than the toffee bar's marginal utility of 14. So that would be the best way forward. However, now we have an option of either buying the first toffee bar or buying the second chocolate bar. This is chocolate. Now the second chocolate bar only gives us 13 in marginal utility, but the first toffee bar, again, it's the first toffee bar because we still haven't bought a single toffee bar. The first option was a chocolate bar. This will give us 14. So 14 is greater than 13, which is why the next step would be to buy the first toffee bar. So we've bought the first chocolate bar, we've bought the first toffee bar now. Now the option is whether we buy the second chocolate bar or the second toffee bar. You can see the second chocolate bar has a marginal utility of 13, but the second toffee bar only has that of 12. So 13 is greater than 12. So we'll go for the second chocolate bar and get 13 marginal utility. And this would be the highest possible utility we can get. I mean, you can just sum those and you get your total utility. But anyhow, they haven't asked us to calculate total utility. They've just asked us what we should buy. So this essentially is 2 chocolate bars and 1 toffee bar. 2 chocolate bars and 1 toffee bar. The silly mistake you could make here is if you buy the first chocolate bar and then you start comparing the second chocolate bar and the second toffee bar. That would be wrong, because if you've bought the first chocolate bar, the choice is the second chocolate bar or the first toffee bar, because you still haven't bought a toffee bar. This is why we got the first toffee bar as our second option to pick. Anyhow, 5B is done, and now we go on to question 6. So the curve JK, okay, I'm trying to highlight it, but my drawing's just terrible. Anyways, let's try again. Okay, this was worse. Third time lucky. All right, that's not too bad. Anyhow, so this is the curve JK, which is our initial budget line. And what combination could cause the budget line to shift to GH, which is essentially it going like this. Now, in such questions, you have to be very careful about looking at the options, because one way to think about this is like, hey, the amount we can buy for good X is going down, so clearly price of X is increased, and the amount we can buy for good Y is going up, so clearly price of Y has decreased. And this is definitely a possible explanation for this shift in the budget line. But the problem is the options only show you that the price of good X only has to change. And the other option is the consumer's money income could change. So we can't make an answer based on a change in price of Y, because that's not given in the options. That's not within the range of possible outcomes we can pick for this. So we have to eliminate that thought process and think just looking at if the price of X is changing and the consumer's money income is changing. These are the only two things that can change. So I'll draw the new thing in blue. So we know that the price, that the consumer's money income, which is the easier thing, it has to increase. Why does it has to increase? Because you can see we're buying more of good Y, but the price of good X is the only thing that's changing. I mean more of good Y when we have 0x at the axis. So the only way to explain this is your money income has increased, because there's no other way that the price of good X could change the total amount of good Y we could buy when the quantity of X is 0. There's just no other way to explain it apart from a change in the price of Y, but again, that's not one of the options. So what we are looking at is there was a parallel shift outwards. This shows that the money income has increased. And then the next step what we had is now the price of X increased. Thus, this had to shift inwards. So it had a pivoted shift inwards. And notice this explains it, because the amount of Y you can buy when X is 0 is still the same as it should be, because only the price of X is changing. But the amount of X you can buy when Y0 has decreased, which makes sense because the price of X is increasing, so you can buy less of X at each particular point. And thus what we saw is an increase, so like a parallel shift outwards because your money income increased, and then a pivoted shift inwards, only affecting your X, by the way, because the price of X has increased. So the price of X has to increase and the money income has to increase. So we can cross this out. The diagram shows the consumer's indifference curves for good F and G together with the consumer budget lines. Okay, great. What could explain the movement from X to Z on the diagram? All right, so now this is interesting. You can look at this question, you can try to figure out what's happening on the diagram. But I think just looking at the options, we can figure out an answer probably much faster. So this says a fall in the price of G. So the price of G is what's falling. So the price of G decreases when G is an inferior good. But what you should note, when you move from X to Z, both G is increasing and good F is increasing. So if G is an inferior good, in an inferior good, it still follows the law of demand. So if the price of G is falling, the quantity of G should be increasing. So that's still fine, because if G is an inferior good, it still follows the inverse nature of the law of demand. So we can go with this if we can eliminate the rest of the options. Because in an inferior good, what you have is since the price falls, you still have a positive substitution effect, because you substitute in favor of G, you want more G because the price has fallen. However, you have a negative income effect, because even though the price of G has fallen, because the price has fallen, you feel richer, your real income has increased. And since it's inferior, if your real income increases, you want less of it. The only difference is your substitution effect outweighs the income effect in inferior goods. It's the opposite in given goods. And that's why your quantity still increases. So a price decrease will lead to a quantity increase. So option A is still correct just by looking at the information in the option. Option B says a fall in the price when F is a given good. But what we should know about given goods is that if you draw the demand supply diagram, quantity and price, the demand curve is upward sloping. It's a perverse demand curve. So in this case, if your price fell, the quantity should have also fallen. But the diagram tells us that the price fell and the quantity rose. This is of G. So just by knowing that the quantity of G is increasing, we can cross out point B, because if G was a given good, then a fall in the price of G should have decreased the quantity of G. Oh, my apologies. Here, F is a given good is written, but that's also wrong, because if F is a given good, then a fall in the price of G shouldn't be affecting F in that way. So that doesn't explain the movement. We need some information regarding G itself. Knowing F is a given good or not does not explain this movement. It just provides incomplete information. This is what I was talking about, that the price of G has fallen. And if G is a given good, then the quantity of G should also fall. However, the diagram shows an increase in the quantity of G. So we can cross this out. A fall in the price of G where G is a normal good. Now, if we look at this in detail, this is potentially where the diagram can help us. So let me just rub some of this out and use a different color. So in a normal good, if the price of G will fall, the substitution effect would always remain positive. It would say increase the amount of G because it's cheaper now, so you should buy more of it. And when the price of G falls, the second thing to look at is your real income also increases because price has fallen, and that kicks in the income effect. But in this case, the income effect is positive. It's a normal good. If your real income increases, you want more of it. So both of these things have to be positive. Now, what we do know is the movement from X to Y, this particular movement, is the substitution effect, which is showing an increase in G. So that's still fine. But if you look at the shift from Y to Z, that's your income effect. But notice your income effect is taking you backwards a bit. So it's taking you back from Y. So it's increasing the amount of F, but it's decreasing slightly the amount of G as opposed to when you had Y. This means that your income effect is negative. Yes, the overall impact is still an increase in G. The substitution effect outweighs the income effect, but the income effect itself is negative, which is what you see in an inferior good case, but not in the case of a normal good. In a normal good, both the substitution and the income effect are positive, and that's why you can go with answer A. A firm has a choice between 5 levels of output. The table shows total cost and total revenue of producing at each output level. The firm could sell whatever output it produces. So we don't have to be worried about demand or selling. Whatever it will produce, it will sell. No worries about that. The firm decides to produce 4,000 units. What is the firm's aim? So at 4,000 units, we have the total cost and we have the total revenue. So the first potential aim is to maximize profit. Now, what you should know about profit is its total revenue minus total cost. So what we can do is we can figure out the difference between total revenue and total cost for each output level. And if 4,000 is truly the maximizing profit output level, then yeah, we can pick A. If not, we can cross out A. So here, your specific profit is 2,000 because 10 minus 8. Here it's 6,000. Here it is 5,000. Again, just total revenue minus total cost. Here it's 28 minus 23 is going to be 5,000. And here it's 0,000. So clearly, if the goal was profit maximization, then 2,000 would have been your profit maximizing output. So clearly, if it's producing 4,000 units, it's not maximizing profit. Is it maximizing sales? Now, again, keep in mind, maximizing sales and maximizing revenue are two very different things. Sales refers to your quantity, like selling as many units as possible. Revenue obviously refers to your revenue, which is units into quantity. So clearly at 4,000, it's not maximizing sales, right? Because to maximize sales, to maximize this, you would have 5,000 because 5,000 is just more sales than 4,000. It's more quantity. So you're not maximizing sales. Are you maximizing revenue? Yep, 28,000 is the highest revenue in this column. So clearly you are maximizing revenue. That is your aim. And to minimize average cost, you will have to calculate this. Again, average cost is total cost divided by output. So the way you do this, you would calculate it for each row. So in this case, your average cost would be 8,000 divided by 1,000, which would make it 8. Then you do it for this thing, which would be 12,000 divided by 2,000, which would be 6. And you can go on for each row and figure out whether at 4,000, is it really minimizing average cost or not. You will find out it's not. And that's why the answer is C, because we've already attained C. We've already seen it is the maximum revenue point. So I'm not going to go over the entire calculation for D, but I've explained for the first two rows as an example as to how you could calculate that if a question should require you to do so in the future. In which type of market structure are commercial banks usually found? Perfect competition. Okay, they're not perfect competition. Let me just a quick tip. But anyways, let's look at the explanation. Perfect competition because they all link their interest rates to that of the central bank. This is wrong. Yes, the central bank can influence the interest rates of commercial banks by either influencing the rate at which they lend to the commercial banks or the rate at which the commercial banks put deposits to the central bank and the interest they get, or through other various open market operations. However, they can influence the interest rates. Like, it doesn't mean it's that the interest rates are all going to be identical. Even if you look around you, probably all the banks that you have don't have exactly identical interest rates that they're offering you for their savings accounts. So yeah, they don't have identical interest rates. Perfect competition because they offer identical products and services. This is also untrue. They don't necessarily offer identical products and services. They are similar, yes, but they are still differentiated. They're differentiated via different packages, different interest rates on savings, different interest rates on loans, trying to get a competitive edge on one or the other, different particular marketing strategies for their particular packages, as well as just different bundle deals for you, so discounts and stuff of that sort. So a lot of non-price competition there as well. So monopolistic competition is definitely better than perfect competition. But here again, they're talking about a competitive market prevents them from making excess profits. Quick secret, banks do make excess profits. But the idea is, like, the banking industry isn't really such a competitive market. It does have, reasonably high entry and exit levels, because there is a lot of sunk costs that go into setting up a bank, a lot of regulation that you have to clear, so a lot of licenses. So there do exist like meaningful barriers to entry in particular. So because there exist meaningful barriers to entry, you can't really call it that a competitive market prevents them from making excess profits. So I don't think you can say it's a monopolistic competition market structure. You can call it an oligopoly. While there may be many other banks, but there are like usually a few large ones that are all competing. And yes, they are affected by the actions of the other banks. So while we might try to offer slightly differentiated services, if one bank if one bank increases interest rates on their saving accounts, the rest of the banks have to increase interest rates. Otherwise, everyone who's saving in their bank will just be like, hey, why should I save here? I'm getting a much better interest rate on my saving. In another bank, I'll just shift it there. So yes, they can differentiate their products and services, but they're still similar to some extent. So in this case, an oligopoly structure does apply. There are a few large banks, and they are impacted by the actions of the other banks. So they do have to match an increase in interest rates, and obviously no one will decrease interest rates because the rest of the banks won't follow. So they are in a way bounded by what the other banks are doing. So the closest one would be an oligopoly market structure. The first three just rely on the banking industry being very competitive, and that's just not really the case, as I've explained before. What is the condition for operating a successful cartel? So how do you successfully collude and do illegal things? Whoops. So cartels collude and to ensure that they can hike up prices collectively and set prices collectively. So what would be the condition for a successful cartel? So slightly less intuitive, but let's go ahead with it. A large number of firms in the industry. This is not useful because if you want to collude, if there are like so many firms in the industry, that just makes collusion so much harder, right? Because then any one specific firm could break the deal and could price below your negotiated higher price, and that would all go wrong. That just makes life a lot more complicated. If there are a large number of firms and you only have a few firms in your collusion, in your cartel, that limits the impact of the collusion. So a large number of firms just fosters competition. It just makes it very difficult for all the firms to come together, collude, and hike up prices. All right. Each firm has a differentiated product. This is not a condition for operating a successful cartel, because whether or not firms have differentiated products does not necessarily impact their ability to collude with one another. If anything, if they have differentiated products, they'll probably try to use the difference in the products to compete with one another, to try to tap into their own niche markets. If they had slightly more similar-ish products, that was when the incentive to collude would be stronger, because they can't compete with one another and steal each other's market share through the differentiation in the product. So might as well just collude and make sure they can collectively increase prices and increase profits, because you can't really differentiate yourself otherwise. Low barriers of entry, again, low barriers of entry would lead to this thing happening, a large number of firms in the industry, and we already explained why that's just bad. Strictly enforced production quotas is what we're left with. And the idea behind production quotas is basically the fixed maximum amount each firm can produce. And these are strictly enforced. So you can still say that these will be enforced. And if there's a fixed maximum amount that each firm can produce, this is great for a cartel. Why? Because the fear of a cartel is what you want to do. You want to collude and get everyone to increase price. The fear you have is someone breaks the agreement and sneakily decreases price and steals everyone's market share because all consumers go to them. This fear is fixed by this, because if everyone has a maximum amount they can produce, they can't even produce more than that, then no one has the incentive to cheat on the cartel, to break the agreement, and to decrease price and steal everyone's market share, because they can't really do that. They have a very strictly enforced production quota. They can't produce more than that anyways, so they have no incentive to try to cheat and decrease price. They have every incentive to collude and increase price with everyone else, because the amount they're producing is more or less the same anyways. So that's why 10D would help in colluding and running a good cartel. So Cambridge is teaching us how to be good cartel members. All right, so question 11. Which assumption is essential for a market to be contestable? Again, what you should know about contestability as opposed to like competition or perfect competition is that in perfect competition, you have a large number of producers within the market. In terms of contestability, there exists a threat of a large number of producers entering the market. So the threat is there, but they don't necessarily actually have to be in the market. It's just that the threat is enough. And this threat occurs because there are low barriers to entry and exit, So because of these low barriers to entry and exit, there exists a threat of producers coming into the market and stealing away your supernormal profits, which is why firms within the market behave like they're in a perfectly competitive structure, even though there might be a few amount of firms in the market. So the question is not about how many firms are in the industry. It's about the fact that new firms could easily enter the industry. So you'll still behave like you're in a state of perfect competition. So that's the thing about contestability. And yeah. Option B clearly shows this, that firms are free to enter and leave the market, shows low barriers to entry and exit. The market is supplied by a large number of firms. This is an assumption for perfect competition, but not necessarily for contestability. Firms cannot earn abnormal profits in the short run. This does follow through. So this is a true statement. You won't earn abnormal profits in the short run because the threat of producers entering the market will exist. But it's not really the essential assumption, right? The essential assumption is that there are low barriers to entry and exit. Because there are low barriers to entry and exit, does point C stand? Because there are low barriers to entry and exit, firms cannot earn abnormal profits. So like the B thing is more important as an essential assumption than point C, even though point C can be correct. Firms can produce differentiated goods. Like sure they can, but like that doesn't really help prove why it's contestable. If anything, similar goods makes it more contestable because there's more threat of new producers coming into the market and stealing away your profits. What is generally associated with the principal agent problem? So again, you have a principal. So in most case, your shareholders, so people who own the company. And then you have the agent, the person who's taking care of the company, so your managers and so on. And the principal agent problem is where the agent has a different incentive than the principal. So the managers have different incentives than shareholders. Anyhow, directors prefer company growth to greater shareholder dividends. This seems like a correct option because shareholders would want dividends. That's how they get money. But directors might want company growth. They are saying they prefer company growth. It can happen to a variety of reasons. The bigger the company, that might be linked to their salary, like the amount of sales, they could use that to show that they've been performing great, all of that. So directors might want that. So directors, like people who are directing the company, similar to managers. But your shareholders would prefer profit, so they get more dividends. Anyhow, managers ignore workers' concerns about the safety in the workplace. The important thing to note here is that workers are neither your principal nor your agent. Your principal are your shareholders, they're the ones that own the company, and they hire managers. So managers ignore workers' concerns about safety, but the principal, shareholders, also ignore workers' concerns about safety because listening to concerns about safety would mean increasing cost and thus decreasing profit. So yeah, this does obviously point B does show a case where two parties are disagreeing, but it's just the important thing is to note that workers aren't either your principal or your agent. Managers are your agents, shareholders are your principals, and both of them are in agreement with unfortunately ignoring workers' concerns. So in that case, there is not a problem. There, in fact, the principal and the agent are on the same page. Shareholder determines the price of the products. I mean, if shareholders themselves are determining the price of the products, then there's no principal agent problem, like who even is the agent in this case. And clearly, if the principal itself has such great control over the price of the products, then you won't have that divergence of interest anyways, because the shareholders are so involved. But yeah, again, they've just mentioned the principal here. They haven't mentioned the agent. So, it's very difficult to identify a principal agent problem without the agent in point C. Workers go on strike against managers' reorganization plans. Again, workers are neither a principal nor an agent. So very, very unfortunately, they're quite irrelevant here. So you can cross that out as well. Because the way to look at it is managers are themselves an agent. They're not your principal. They're not the initial people who have a stake in the company, who have some ownership in the company. So they are an agent. They're designed to take care of the company. The workers could be seen as a sub-agent of managers, so people hired even more to take care of the company. But you're missing out your principal in this particular case. And again, as in C, it's difficult to extract a principal agent problem without a principal. Usually impossible. But anyways, question 13. Sorry. The table shows the output of chairs at a factory when different number of workers are employed. Just give me 1 second. sorry about that. Anyways, when different number of workers are employed, when will diminishing marginal returns to labor set in? So this essentially means that the marginal returns to labor, so when you have plus 1 unit of labor, the increase in output is your marginal returns, and diminishing marginal returns don't necessarily mean that an additional unit of labor will have a negative impact. It will just mean that an additional unit of labor would have a less positive impact than the original than the previous unit of labor. So what this essentially means is, like, if if an additional labor had an impact of plus 10, and the next labor has an impact of, let's say, plus 8, that's your diminishing marginal returns, because the marginal returns themselves are decreasing. So let's see how we can do this on this particular question. So for hiring your first worker, you have plus 7, you go from 0 to 7, so that's 7 of marginal returns. Hiring your second worker, you have plus 10, so marginal returns are 10. Hiring your third worker, you have 26 minus 17, that's plus 9. And this is where you stop, because you clearly have seen a decrease in the marginal returns, and that is where diminishing marginal returns are setting in. So this is where you go to your third worker. So when the third worker is employed. Let's zoom out a bit. Yeah. The chart gives information about the average daily wage rate for all industries in India. So it is increasing, which is good. Not increasing fast enough, but increasing. What could have caused this trend in wage rates? So what would lead to the wage rates increasing? An increase in capital intensive production. I mean, if you have more capital intensive production, that would just lead to less demand for labor. And if there's less demand for labor, that just decreases your wage rate. Again, you can draw a labor demand and supply diagram. So demand for labor, supply for labor, and you can see that a decrease in demand would decrease your wage rate. You can go out and draw the shift if you want to. An increase in the number of industrial workers. So if there's an increase in the number of industrial workers, and this is the average daily wage rate for all industries, so presumably that increases the supply. So the number of industrial workers are more, so the supply of labor increases. Again, if the supply of labor increases, you can see that there's just a decrease in the wage rate. It doesn't help. So that's not what we're looking for. An increase in the number of people unemployed. Now, the number of people unemployed in this case, again, does not necessarily affect your supply, because they're still in the labor force, they're still there, so the supply hasn't changed. It's just that they aren't being employed as much, and this is usually happens due to a decrease in the demand for labor. You don't need labor as much, so that's why you're unemploying more people. And as we discussed before, a decrease in the demand for labor just will reduce the wage rate, won't necessarily increase it. And which leads us to option D, an increase in the productivity of labor. Clearly, if the productivity of labor increases, we are doing an A2 paper. So yeah, hopefully all of you know about MRP and how that is linked to your demand for labor. So the marginal ratio product that increases, and if your MRP increases, your demand for labor increases. If your demand for labor increases, you can use a diagram to see how your wage rate would increase. Okay, question 15. A country has a negative income tax regime. Let's zoom out a bit. The curve NT in the diagram shows the country's initial tax schedule, so this curve. And a change in the tax rate caused the schedule to shift to NT1. How will this affect work incentives and after-tax distribution of income? So the first thing you should note, two things, is that in terms of the tax, if you look here, the tax rate is going down. So just the rate itself is going down, because at every income, you're just being taxed less. So like you're being taxed this instead of this, you're being taxed this instead of this. So the tax is going down. But similarly, if you look here at the negative axis of the taxation, obviously If it taxes the government taking money from you, so negative taxation would be the government giving money to you. So this would usually be welfare spending, which is why it's for people below a certain income level. And you notice this has decreased. This has become from more negative, less negative. So this has just, in a way, in terms of welfare spending, this has decreased. So you're having this much welfare spending if you are unemployed as opposed to this much welfare spending. So your welfare spending is decreasing. And that makes sense because your tax is decreasing. So obviously you'll have less welfare spending. So work incentives, naturally, if there's less tax and there's less welfare spending, you would have a higher incentive to work because you don't get unemployment benefits anymore. And if you work, your income doesn't get taxed away as much. But the distribution of income is going to be less equal. Why is it less equal? Because you have less welfare spending. So that is very important for a slightly better distribution of income because it gives money to the unemployed, to people working low income jobs. And the reason why you have less welfare spending is also because you are taxing less. So if you were taxing more, that would help tax the people at the top and then give the money to those at the bottom. So yeah, you're going to worsen off inequality. But anyhow, question 16. There's a fixed supply of skilled workers in an industry. Firms can no longer find enough workers to meet their demand for labor. Okay, so there's a fixed supply of skilled workers. So this is not going to change, irrespective of wage or of anything. It's just fixed. And firms can no longer find enough workers to meet their demand for labor. So they have a demand for labor, but there's just not enough workers for that. And what could be the solution be? Allow wage rates to fall as the market demands. Again, this fixed supply of labor won't change irrespective of the wage rates because it's fixed. It's like, it's like this. It's a fixed supply of labor. So you can increase or decrease wage rates as much as you want. It won't change. And obviously, allowing wage rates to fall wouldn't help get more people anyways. Introducing work sharing and reducing working hours. I mean, if you're reducing working hours, you already don't have enough laborers to meet your demand for labor. Now you're reducing working hours. So now you'll have even less amount of labor. So this won't necessarily help. Make offices more attractive by adding air conditioning. I mean, this might make offices more attractive, but the point is there's a fixed supply of skilled workers in an industry. So you don't have enough skilled workers in the first place. And I doubt adding some ACs to offices will convince someone to go to university and acquire the skills required for your industry, and then come and work there. So the supply is fixed, unfortunately, and I don't think ACs are a good enough reason for the supply to increase, especially the supply for such a difficult thing, for such skilled workers. Like, notice that there's already like excess demand for labor, so your wages are probably high already. So if wages aren't leading to more workers, clearly ACs won't. Provide more training courses for new recruits. And this is going to be your correct option, because if you have more training courses for new recruits, what this does is increase their productivity. So they're more useful to the firm faster. And why is higher productivity important? Because the same workers can now produce more because they're better trained, they have like higher productivity. And that's what you need. You have a fixed supply of workers. However, you need more because you need to produce more output, but you can't get more workers. They're a fixed supply. So what you can do is increase the productivity of your existing workers so that you can produce more from the same amount of workers, because the amount of workers isn't changing. A government is worried that about the increasing monopsony power. So monopsony is essentially the sole buyer of labor. So it's like a monopolist, except a monopsonist exists in the labor market. It's like one firm which buys all the labor in that particular industry. There are no other particular firms you could go to. So you could think about this as like the industry or the labor market for firefighters. You can only like be hired by the government. There's not really any other job. So that's just one particular firm that's going to buy you, or one particular agent that's going to buy you. or hire you might be the more appropriate word. Anyhow, but because of a monopsony existing, uh, government is worried about its increasing power in the wage bargaining process. So it's worried that the firm is getting too strong in the wage bargaining process, and it's probably going to negotiate a lower wage than what is fair. So which policy combination is most likely to improve the wages and employment prospects of workers? All right, so we can zoom in a bit. Trade unions always help your wages and employment prospects. Well, maybe not always, but always help when you are faced off against a monopsony. And there's a very nice trade union versus monopsony diagram in your syllabus which shows that when faced off against a monopsony, a trade union can increase wage without having to decrease employment. I'm not going to go over it here because it'll just be too detailed for an MCQ video. But just think of it intuitively. Monopsony has too much power. Trade unions help people collectivize and balance that power by collectively bargaining against the monopsonist. Immigration controls. So the control implies that how strict or harsh the controls are. So like how much you're restricting it. Now, the thing is, you would have to strengthen the immigration controls. And by strengthening immigration controls, it just means that there is going to be less immigration. Less people coming into the country because the controls are strengthened. So let's just be clear on that. And the reason why this is the right thing to pick, because if you relax it, if you do the opposite, and more people come in, if there's more immigration, if you do this would mean more immigration. The problem with this is this just increases the supply of labor. And as we looked at before, increase in supply of labor, you can draw the diagram if you wish, just decreases your wage rate. So it doesn't help improve the wages, and it also won't help improve employment prospects because there are more people competing for the same amount of jobs. So Cambridge making us consider some right-wing rhetoric, but the unfortunate reality is that if you want to improve your wages and your employment prospects against a monopsony, less immigration would be the way to go about. So the supply of labor decreases, which then increases your wage rate. So you would have to go with strengthening the controls and thus having less immigration. And national minimum wage, you want to raise it, because if you cut it, then the monopsony can just pay the workers even less. And the monopsony does have the bargaining power to do that. So clearly you want to increase the minimum wage so that the monopsony is forced to pay them at least a higher minimum wage. All of that gives you 17B. What is not a source of market failure? Imperfect information is a source of market failure. We have to cross it out because the question is what is not a source? Because you might lack information about the true benefits of a particular good or service, and thus might demand less of it. So goods and services which have external benefits, you usually lack information about it. You might also not care, but you might also just lack information. So that is a source of market failure. So imperfect information definitely is a source of market failure, and which is why, as a measure to correct market failure, lots of the measures rely around increasing awareness for merit goods. Income inequality is something that market failure does not factor in. Market failure is just looking at merit goods, demerit goods, monopoly power, things of that sort. So all of the production side, not necessarily the way income is distributed. So income inequality is not a source of market failure. Monopoly power, again, is a source of market failure when companies come together through mergers or acquisitions and hike up the prices. That is definitely a textbook example of market failure. And non-excludability is also an example of market failure. Non-excludability of public goods leads to the free rider problem. Because they're non-excludable, you can't exclude non-payers, so there will be free riders who don't pay for it. Thus, the private sector can't charge a price, and the private sector won't produce it. So in a market economy, you have no or minimal public goods, and this stems from non-excludability of public goods. So you're left with B. A government regards fresh fruit and vegetables as merit goods, and subsidies, So fresh fruits and vegetables are merit goods, and it subsidizes agriculture to boost their production. What could be a government failure arising from these subsidies? So what's could be a particular case where this intervention by the government does like more harm than good, and that would be a government failure. So if the subsidies lead to cheaper fresh fruit and vegetables, that's a good thing. So this is not a case of government failure, because the entire point is you want to subsidize this so that you have more and more affordable fruit and vegetables, because you want more people to consume them. They're a merit good. Land clearance reducing wildlife, this is definitely possible, because if we subsidize agriculture, that will reduce the cost of production of agriculture and increase the supply of agriculture. And to produce more, to accommodate that boost of production, they would need more land. So it could lead to land clearance, deforestation, so that they can produce more fruits and vegetables. And this could be a case of government failure, because on one side you did a good thing by subsidizing a merit good, but it had a horrible bad side to it as well. Land clearance, deforestation, reducing wildlife, all of those things are bad. Lower spending on treating dietary illnesses, this is a good thing. I mean, if you're spending less on treating these illnesses because people are having more fruits, that's great. There's no failure in that. And more jobs, again, is also a good thing. There's no government failure there either. Which type of unemployment is associated with a deficiency in aggregate demand? This would be cyclical. So cyclical unemployment fluctuates with the cycles of the the trends of the business cycle. So as aggregate demand increases, you have more unemployment, you have more employment. So when you're in a state of growth or at your boom point, and when you go into your recession or your slump, aggregate demand will decrease. And this is the entire cycle of this is the entire business cycle of the economy, and that's where the name cyclical comes from. So as your aggregate demand increases or decreases based on that business cycle, that's why with the name cyclical is there. Now frictional is where people, like, there exists vacancies that people don't know enough about those vacancies. So there's this informational gap between people who want jobs and people who want to hire them, which is quite larger than one might think. So that's a different type of unemployment. Structural is like demand shift. It's where some industries become redundant and other industries is where the new demand goes for. So people might not want, like base coal miners anymore maybe, and might want more skilled laborers to work on solar panels, maybe in the next 10, 20 years. So that would be an example of structural unemployment. It's not necessarily a deficiency in aggregate demand. It just shows the fact that the aggregate demand has shifted to another industry. So it would be wrong to say that the aggregate demand is less. It's just that the demand has shifted from one industry to another. The aggregate demand would probably have similar levels then. And voluntary is just where you don't want to work for a certain amount of time. All right, let me just come back. All right, let's finish up the last 10 questions of this paper. If you're still here, kudos to you. In the diagram, OP is the equilibrium level of income, and OQ, the full employment level of income in a closed economy. So OP is your equilibrium level of income because this shows where you have the intersection with the 45-degree line, which is this line. It shows that income and expenditure are equal. So the reason this is the equilibrium level of income is because if you look at this particular AD line, and the reason you should look at this particular AD line is because it's a closed economy. So you won't have X minus M, but you will have all three other components. But yeah, so it is intersecting the 45-degree line at this particular point, showing that expenditure and income are the same. And because expenditure and income are the same, that is why OP is your equilibrium level of income. So if you were confused by which of these three lines do I pick, the fact that OP is your equilibrium level of income, and only at this particular point the other two lines aren't intersecting the 45-degree line, should already tell you that, oh, this is the line I should be looking at, the C plus I plus G line, not the other two lines. And OQ is your full employment level of income. And they've asked at your full employment level of income, what is the deflationary gap? So you'll measure the deflationary gap vertically. So at OQ, C plus I plus G shows this. The 45-degree line shows this. This is where we should have been if you wanted like no output gap. And thus VU, or UV rather, would be your deflationary gap. Because the idea is for this specific income, you should have this much expenditure, you should have V amount of expenditure. Unfortunately, you have this much less expenditure. So this is the deflationary gap. All right, question 22. What represents an injection into a country's circular flow of income? Corporate taxes are a withdrawal. You're literally taxing money from the circular flow of income, extracting it from there. So it's just a withdrawal that goes to the government and it is removed from the circular flow of income. Interest payment on government bonds is an injection because you could buy a government bond. So let's say it's the government. They give you a particular bond. This is your economy. So yes, when you buy the bond, this will be a withdrawal because you are going to pay the money for the bond. So the price of the bond, that would be a withdrawal. But every time the bond gives you interest, that is money from the government to the economy. So that is definitely an injection. So the interest on the bond is an injection, but naturally the price of the bond would be a withdrawal. Thankfully, they've answered the interest payments on government bonds. So that is where the government is giving you interest. The government is essentially injecting that interest payment into the economy. So that's an injection. Dividends to foreign shareholders would be a withdrawal. They're literally leaving the economy, going to some other foreign shareholder. And the repayment of bank loans is like neither. It's just money that's within the economy. Like it was in the bank initially, then it went to you. Now you're paying it back to the bank. So it's just within the economy. It's not changing anything. All right. What will be the most likely consequence of an increase in the dependency ratio? So the dependency ratio essentially is the number of dependents. So the number of people who are beyond the age of working or below it. So like you are looking at oldies and young people, and that divided by your labor force. So your labor force are the people who are willing and able to work. So the people who can't work divided by the people who can work, and you can multiply that by 100 if you want it in a percentage form. Anyways, so what is the consequence of an increase in the dependency ratio? So you have more oldies and more young people, let's say. So a decrease in GDP per head is correct because the people working are the same, right? But there are more old and young people who aren't working. So the output will be the same. So the GDP will be the same, but the GDP per head will decrease because there are just more amount of old and young people who aren't working, but the output is still the same. So the output is divided across more amount of people, and thus is a decrease in GDP per head. A decrease in labor productivity, I mean, the existence of old and young people does not affect the labor productivity of the labor force. So you can cross that out. Increase in the labor force, this is wrong because the labor force is literally the same. The point is that the old and young people have increased. If anything, the labor force could have decreased. A decrease in the labor force could increase the dependency ratio, but an increase in the labor force would just decrease the dependency ratio. So that would be the opposite of what we're looking at. And an increase in unemployment, I think when I was looking at the examiner report for this paper, this was actually a common mistake in question 23, because what you have to understand is that if people are growing old or if people are too young, they don't count as unemployed. They don't increase the unemployment rate, right? The unemployment rate is, or the unemployed are only those people who are part of the labor force, who are willing and able to work and of the age to work, and then don't find jobs. So the old people and the young people, like the kids, don't count in unemployment. Yes, they aren't working, but you can't technically say they are unemployed. They are retired or they are too young to work, because they don't even fall within the age that for where it's permitted to work. So you have to be willing and able to work, and older young people aren't able to work. That's why they don't count within unemployment. All right. Which statement is correct? Let's use a different colored marker because this is getting messy. Economic development is necessary for economic growth. Now remember, economic growth is largely looking at your GDP type stuff, your GDP, your GNP. So just like in terms of output growth, economic development is looking at your GDP, GNP type stuff, plus other factors. So factors like the HDI that take into account, looking at child mortality, looking at education, might also look at doctors per thousand. So economic development tries to look at a more holistic view of standards of living, which includes GDP, but economic growth just looks at GDP or GNP. But point being, it just looks at output. So economic development is not necessary for economic growth. You can have just a growth in output and a growth in GDP and be horrible in the other factors. You'd be horrible in terms of child mortality, be horrible in terms of environmental degradation. So that's completely fine. So this is not a correct statement. It's not necessary for this. Economic growth and economic development are directly proportional. The same logic applies here. It's not the case. Yes, economic growth looks at GDP, and economic development also looks at GDP, but economic development looks at so many more factors. So you would have great growth, and that would positively impact your economic development, but you could have horrible environmental degradation, which would negatively impact your economic development. You could have horrible child mortality, horrible education. So all of those things would negatively impact your economic development. So it's very possible, and you could look at the Chinese economies or lots of Asian economies' recent growth to see high levels of economic growth, but very low or decreasing levels of economic development. So standards of living are falling, but there's a lot of growth. So they're not necessarily directly proportional. Economic growth always enables economic development. This is true, yes. You need growth for development. Like, development relies on more than just growth, but it does still rely on growth. So economic growth will enable economic development, but it will not guarantee it. It will not mean that you're necessarily directly proportional, but it will enable it. It is a starting point for economic development, but economic development is just a lot more, looks at a lot more factors. But enabling is still a fine word here. And yeah, this is just a joke. Economic growth is always sustainable. No, it can damage the environment severely. It can be based off lots of loans, so it doesn't have to be always sustainable. The diagram shows a PPC. The economy is initially at point X. If the economy achieves actual economic growth but not potential growth, what would be the final position? Now, this will still remain your PPC, right? Because this thing is not the case. You don't have potential growth. So PPC1 is still the PPC we'll be looking at. PPC2 is not something that will occur because you don't have potential growth. So you can automatically cross out B and C because they all exceed the points of PPC1, which is an impossibility. They're going beyond the full level of employment, and thus, we won't consider them because we aren't saying there's a potential growth or anything. So now you're left with option A and option D. Now, the way to look at this is simple. Not so simple, but still relatively simple. In option A, you have a slight increase in capital goods, but you have a stark decrease in consumer goods. So option A won't really be a clear-cut option for economic growth. So I mean, it's not clear that this is actual growth. So it's growing in capital goods, but it's decreasing in consumer goods more. Option D is your correct option. The reason being because your capital goods are remaining the same, but you have an increase in consumer goods. So this is a clear-cut option for actual growth because one commodity, capital goods, is remaining the same, but the other commodity is clearly increasing. So consumer goods clearly going up. And that's why it's clear that actual growth is occurring. It has been estimated by the UN that the total external debt of developing countries has been increasing by about 425 billion each year. That's a lot of money. But anyways, that's pretty bad. So developing countries, they have their debt is increasing, which is bad. So let's see the options. What is least likely to have contributed to this? So what's the least likely factor which led to this horrible situation to come to pass? Disincentives for foreign investments through political instability. This is a very likely factor, because if you have political instability and you don't have FDI coming in, that will just worsen the situation of your economy, push you towards more debt. Increased government subsidies for development of tourism industries. This is probably least likely, because this is it's like a good thing. If you have government subsidies and you're trying to capitalize on your tourism industries, that should help you get tourists and get, like, foreign exchange and, an injection to the economy. This should help. This should not, worsen you and push you towards debt. Withdrawal of MNCs due to delays in the award of government contracts. Yeah, if MNCs withdraw, you have less output in your economy, and naturally that would worsen your economic situation, push you towards getting more debt. And worsening the terms of trade. So price of exports upon price of imports. If price of exports falls or price of imports rises, that's a worsening situation of the terms of trade, and that will worsen off your situation with developed economies, because now when you're exporting, you're earning less for every export. Most exports for developing countries are price inelastic, like agro-based products and all have relatively fixed demands. So a decrease in, like, the price of exports will just decrease your revenue, and an increase in the price of imports will just make, affording things like importing oil or importing raw materials or importing capital goods much more expensive. And often to finance this, you have to borrow. And that's the particular problem. Even in Pakistan's case, like, just to, like, finance the import of oil, that's often a big reason why we borrow. Anyhow, the following are 4 conditions sometimes attached to IMF loans to developing countries. Yes, these are horrible things. But anyways, which condition would conflict with the infant industry argument? The infant industry argument is the argument that you need to protect your infant industries through, like, protectionist measures like tariffs or quotas, such that the infant industries will then develop their comparative advantage and be, comparative in the long run. So you need to develop them in the short run, somewhat to what I think India did for some of its industries very successfully. And yeah, this is definitely in conflict with it. The need to allow free trade. Obviously, if you have free trade, then you can't have protectionist measures to protect your infant industry in the short run. So the need to allow free trade, it will be in direct conflict with the infant industry argument. Inflation, contractionary government fiscal policy, privatization, they're all not linking to trade, and essentially it's trade and protectionism, which refers to the infant industry argument. In which exchange rate regime would the central bank of a country be best able to pursue an independent monetary policy to control the rate of inflation? So an independent monetary policy, so, like, if they want to control inflation, they would either increase interest rates, decrease interest rates, alongside with various other operations that they can do. So where can they do this easily independently? It would be a freely floating exchange rate system. Now, why is that, you might wonder? And you might look at these other 2 options where, it has a fixed rate, or where it has a targeted value in relation to the dollar, so a particular target for your exchange rate, or a fixed rate altogether. And the problem with both B and C as opposed to A is that in B and C, you can't have an independent monetary policy and just pursue it very freely. Because if you're trying to, let's say, have a contractionary monetary policy and increase interest rates in the hope of decreasing aggregate demand, you would have other problems. You would have problems related to your exchange rate. That, oh, shoot, if we increase interest rates, what will that do to our exchange rate? That will lead to an inflow of money that will appreciate our currency. How does that impact our targeted value? How does that impact our fixed rate of selling foreign currency. If we decrease interest rates to, let's say, increase aggregate demand because you want a higher rate of inflation, maybe that will decrease your exchange rate because hot money will flow out of your economy because you have a less, a smaller interest rate. That will be detrimental to your targeted value. That will be detrimental to the fact you have to sell foreign currency at a fixed rate. So both in B and C, this simply means that there are other related but conflicting goals that a central bank would have, i.e., exchange rate management. In A, the central bank doesn't have to worry about exchange rate management. It's a freely floating exchange rate system. It'll go up, it'll go down, it'll do its thing. It will only make decisions around interest rates solely on the basis of inflation. So here it's best able to control inflation because it doesn't have to worry about what's happening to my exchange rate. It's a freely floating exchange rate system. Whatever happens to it isn't so big of a problem. And you can cross out D because if you participate in a monetary union with other countries and you have a common currency, then again, you have a common central bank. Like you can't really independently have different monetary policies. You have some monetary policy standardization across countries. So that would be a problem. What is measured on the vertical axis of the Phillips curve? You should know that the Phillips curve looks at your inflation rate and then looks at unemployment and shows that there's a trade-off between the two. Like it's a very badly drawn Phillips curve. So on your vertical axis, you have the rate of inflation. Not much to that MCQ, just like you should just remember your Phillips curve, I suppose. Workers in poor countries are often less productive than workers using the same technology in rich countries. So the technology is the same. We're saying that workers in poorer countries are like just less productive with it. And how can we most likely fix the solution, this situation? Increase in the savings ratio in poor countries. I mean, if you're saving